The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl bound behind a vending machine area, and his rage turned the station red. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's intense story. Imagine this. You walk into a gas station. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the sound of tires rolling in and out of the parking lot, and the occasional ding of the door opening and closing. It seems like an ordinary day, but for one Hells Angels biker, the world was about to be turned upside down. As he walked through the station, his sharp eyes scanned the area like a predator on alert. His leather jacket creaked with each step, the worn patches on his back telling stories of a life that few dared to approach. Then, just as he reached the snack aisle, something caught his attention, a sound, a faint cry, barely audible over the hum of the station. His gaze snapped to the corner, where behind a row of vending machines, something was wrong. He could see a little girl, bound and struggling to free herself from the tight ropes that held her in place. She was pale, tears streaking down her cheeks, her small body trembling in fear. Panic surged through the biker's chest, but it was quickly replaced with a cold, burning rage. He moved without thinking, his instincts taking over. The biker stormed toward her, his boots pounding against the floor, each step closer making the tension in the air grow thicker. His hands were steady as he crouched down to cut the ropes with a knife from his belt. As he freed the girl, her eyes flickered with fear, unsure of whether he was here to help or to hurt. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe now," he said in a low, soothing voice, his gruff exterior softening just a bit. But the girl, frightened and disoriented, backed away, still uncertain. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked, her words tremulous. The biker froze, taken aback by her question. His heart sank as he realized just how much fear and pain this young girl had endured. He could see the bruises on her arms, the remnants of something far darker than a mere accident. "No, sweetheart," he replied firmly, his voice gentle, yet carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much violence in his life. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to make sure you're okay." As he spoke, he noticed the girl's hands were shaking uncontrollably. His heart tightened, and the protective instinct within him flared up stronger than ever. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair away from her tear-streaked face. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for the truth in his gaze. Slowly, the fear began to fade from her face as she realized this biker wasn't like the others. He wasn't here to harm her. But then, as he helped her stand, the realization hit him. Whoever had done this to her was still out there, watching, and he was about to make them regret ever laying a hand on her. The biker's eyes narrowed, a dark promise forming in his chest. This wasn't just about helping a little girl anymore. It was about justice, and anyone who dared to hurt the innocent would have to answer to him. As he helped her toward the front of the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The storm was coming, and it would be red. He knew that much for sure. The biker stood there, staring at the little girl as she clung to his side, her tiny body trembling. The storm outside had only worsened, the rain hammering against the windows, making the station feel like a small island in the middle of a raging ocean. Inside, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with tension. The little girl, her face still pale from fear, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are they going to come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The biker's jaw tightened as he knelt down to her level, his weathered face softening as he looked into her eyes. "No one is going to hurt you again, I promise," he said, his voice low but firm, like the promise of a storm that could not be stopped. He could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on him, and something deep inside stirred. His heart, which had been hardened over the years, was slowly melting away, piece by piece, as he stood there with this fragile little girl. He had lived a life of violence, of anger, and of revenge. It was all he knew. But now, with her at his side, he felt something new, a sense of responsibility, something that made him want to protect her at all costs. The last thing he wanted was to see her suffer like that again. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the cold, dark corner of the station, and he couldn't let that happen to her again. He looked at her, trying to comfort her the best he could. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "Emily." Her voice was so small, so fragile, and it broke something inside of him. Emily had been through so much already, and yet here she was, still fighting to survive. "Emily, we're going to get you out of here," the biker said, standing up and glancing toward the door. The storm raged outside, but it was the least of his worries. His mind was already working, thinking about the danger that still loomed. Whoever had done this to her was still out there. He had no idea who they were, but he was damn sure he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The biker grabbed his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he knew by heart. "I need you to help me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've got a little girl here, and there are people after her. We need to get her out of here now." The voice on the other end of the line responded quickly, a note of concern creeping in. "Where are you?" "Gas station, off Highway 35, the biker replied. "Get here fast. I'm not sure how much longer we have." He hung up, turning back to Emily, who was now looking around the station, her eyes wide with fear. He could tell she was still processing everything that had happened to her, but he had no time to waste. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "We're going to be okay, Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "You're not alone anymore. I've got you." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of trust in them. She nodded slowly, clinging to his side as he led her toward the door. The biker's senses were on high alert as they stepped outside into the cold, biting wind. His eyes scanned the parking lot, but there was no sign of anyone. Yet, he knew they were coming. He could feel it in his bones. He kept a tight grip on Emily's hand as they moved quickly across the lot, heading toward his motorcycle. The engine rumbled to life, its deep roar cutting through the storm. "Hold on tight," he said to Emily as he helped her onto the bike. She wrapped her arms around him, her body trembling with fear, but he didn't let go of her. He could sense the danger closing in, and he wasn't going to stop until she was safe. They tore out of the parking lot, the rain falling harder, the wind howling in their ears as they sped down the empty highway. The biker's mind raced as he thought of the people who had hurt Emily. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until they had her back. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He would do whatever it took to protect her. The storm raged on, but the biker's resolve only grew stronger. He could feel Emily clinging to him, her small body pressed against his back, and he knew he wasn't just protecting her from the storm outside. He was protecting her from the darkness that had tried to take her. As they rode through the night, the biker made a promise to himself. No matter what, he would keep her safe. The danger was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally doing something right. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was a protector, and nothing was going to change that. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as the biker and Emily tore down the highway. The bike roared beneath them, the wind biting through their clothing, but the biker barely noticed. His mind was consumed by one thought: keeping Emily safe. He could feel the weight of her small body against his back, the way her arms tightened around him with each bump in the road. She had been through more in her short life than most people would ever experience, and now, she was depending on him. That thought filled him with a fierce protectiveness that burned hotter than any rage he had ever felt. His grip on the handlebars tightened as they approached a small town on the edge of the highway. He needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. He glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if they were being followed, but the road behind them was empty. For now, they were in the clear. The biker slowed as they neared the outskirts of town, steering the motorcycle toward a quiet, secluded area by a small diner. He didn't want to risk drawing attention to himself by stopping in the middle of the street. As they pulled into the parking lot, he helped Emily off the bike, supporting her as she stumbled slightly. She had been holding on to him tightly the entire ride, but now that they were stopped, she seemed to be shaking from exhaustion. The biker's heart ached seeing her like this, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "We're going to be okay, Emily," he said, trying to sound reassuring, even though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Just stay close to me." Emily nodded, though the fear was still visible in her eyes. She had been through hell, and it wasn't over yet. The biker led her into the diner, scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of truck drivers hunched over their coffee cups in the corner. He didn't feel threatened, but he was still on high alert. He could hear the low murmur of their voices, but it was nothing compared to the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. The woman behind the counter smiled as they entered, but her expression shifted to concern when she saw Emily's pale face and the way the biker was holding her. "Are you two okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I'll be fine," the biker replied, giving her a quick glance before turning back to Emily. "We just need a place to sit for a bit, get out of the rain." The woman nodded and gestured to a booth in the back. "Take a seat. I'll get you some coffee." As they made their way to the booth, the biker noticed that Emily was still clinging to him. She wasn't ready to let go yet, and he didn't blame her. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to feel alone in a world that didn't care. He had spent most of his life trying to survive, one day at a time, never trusting anyone, never letting anyone get close. But Emily had changed all that. She had shattered the walls he had so carefully built around himself, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The woman brought over 2 cups of coffee and a glass of water for Emily, then left them alone. Emily took a sip of the water, her hands still trembling slightly. The biker watched her carefully, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this to her? Why had they targeted a little girl? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no random act of violence. Whoever had hurt her was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they had her back. He glanced at the door again, his senses on edge. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for them. "What happened to you, Emily?" he asked quietly, his voice softening. She looked up at him, her eyes still full of fear, but there was something else there now. Something that told him she was ready to trust him. She took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My mom. She disappeared when I was little," Emily said. "And then, they came. They said they were taking me to her, but I knew they were lying. They locked me in that place and... Her voice trailed off, and the biker could see the pain in her eyes. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to say any more if it's too much," he said softly. Emily nodded, her lip trembling. "I just want to go home," she whispered. The biker's heart clenched at her words. He knew that feeling all too well, the longing to return. To something familiar, something safe. But there was no going back for either of them. They couldn't go back to the lives they had left behind. The biker stood up, his hand still resting on Emily's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, I promise," he said, his voice steady with determination. "But we need to keep moving. We're not safe here." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also something else, hope. And that was all he needed to see. He wasn't just going to protect her. He was going to give her something he had never given anyone before, a chance at a future. The biker helped her stand, and together, they walked out of the diner, ready to face whatever came next. The biker and Emily rode through the night. The highway stretched out before them like a dark, endless road. The only sound was the low hum of the motorcycle and the occasional gust of wind. The rain had finally stopped, but the night still felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. Emily had fallen silent, her small hands gripping the biker's waist tighter as they rode, as if she were afraid to let go. The biker could feel the weight of her fear pressing against him, and it only strengthened his resolve to keep her safe. He had no idea who was after her, but he wasn't about to let anyone take her again. The town they had passed earlier had felt too quiet, too easy. It was the calm before the storm, and the biker knew that storm was coming. He glanced back over his shoulder, scanning the road for any sign of trouble. The headlights of their bike illuminated the dark, empty highway, but he wasn't fooled. They could be anywhere. He tried to shake off the sense of unease gnawing at him, but it lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. They needed to find a place to hide. He couldn't risk being followed. After what felt like hours, they reached a small motel just off the main highway. It was old, run down, and empty, just the way he liked it. The biker slowed the bike, pulling into the parking lot. The place was quiet, with only a few flickering lights to guide them. He helped Emily off the bike, steadying her as she wobbled. Slightly, her legs still unsteady from the ride. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to keep moving, but for now, this will do." Emily didn't say anything, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was tired, scared, and just wanted to feel safe again. The biker knew that feeling all too well. He had spent most of his life running, keeping his distance from everyone and everything. But now, with Emily, everything had changed. She was his responsibility, and that was something he couldn't run from. They made their way to the front desk, where the clerk barely looked up as they entered. He was an older man, hunched over, eyes bloodshot from too many late nights. The biker didn't care. He just needed a room, a place where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. 2 for the night, the biker said, his voice rough. The clerk handed him a key without a word, and they made their way to the room. It was small, nothing fancy, but it was enough. The biker locked the door behind them, then turned to Emily. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the floor. The biker could see the tension in her body, the way her small hands trembled slightly. "You're safe here," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone anymore." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if they find me? What if they come after me again?" The biker sat down beside her, his rough hands gently resting on her shoulder. "They won't find you," he said firmly, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "I won't let them." He could feel the weight of her words, the fear that gripped her heart. She had been through so much already, and he could see how much it had changed her. But he also saw something else in her: strength, resilience, a will to survive. She had been through hell, and she was still standing. That was something he admired. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't have an answer for her. He wasn't sure why he was helping her. He had spent his life running from responsibility, from anything that could tie him down. But when he saw her, when he heard her cries for help, something in him shifted. He couldn't just walk away. Not this time. "Because you need help," he said simply, though he knew that wasn't the full answer. There was something deeper, something he couldn't put into words. "And because I can't just leave you." Emily didn't say anything more, but the way she looked at him made him feel like she understood. They were in this together now, whether he was ready for it or not. The biker stood up and moved to the small window, peering out into the night. The parking lot was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The storm outside had passed, but the real storm was still coming, and he was ready to face it head on. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Emily. Not on his watch. The room was quiet, save for the soft sound of Emily's breathing, as they both tried to find some semblance of peace in the chaos that surrounded them. The biker sat back down beside her, his hand resting on hers. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. Together, the night dragged on, and as the hours passed, they both tried to get some sleep, knowing that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time in a long time, the biker felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the room. The biker woke up first, the weight of the previous night still pressing on him. His eyes moved to the small bed where Emily lay, her small form curled up under the blanket, her breathing slow and steady. The biker sat up, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had promised to protect her, but every passing minute brought them closer to a danger that neither of them was fully prepared for. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was too early for anyone to be checking in, and the sense of unease he had been feeling all night returned with full force. He stood up quickly, moving silently toward the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a figure standing outside, their face hidden under the brim of a hat. The biker's hand hovered over the handle, ready to pull the door open, but he knew better than to act impulsively. He had learned that lesson the hard way. With a deep breath, he slowly unlatched the door and cracked it open just enough to see who was there. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the stranger. The man outside stood tall, his face hardened, his clothes well worn. He looked like someone who had been around the block more times than he could count. "I'm looking for a girl," the man said, his voice gravelly. "She's about this tall, dark hair, looks like she's been through hell." The biker's heart skipped a beat. Emily. He hadn't expected this so soon, but here it was, the moment he had feared. The biker clenched his fists at his sides, keeping his composure. I don't know who you're talking about, he said flatly, his tone betraying nothing. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The man outside didn't seem fazed by the biker's words. In fact, he stepped forward, his shadow falling across the door. I'm not here for a friendly chat, the man said, his voice getting colder. I suggest you open the door and let me in before I make things worse for you. The biker's pulse quickened, his mind racing as he processed the situation. He couldn't afford to let this man inside. Emily was still asleep, still unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. The biker reached down and grabbed the knife he kept hidden in his boot, his fingers tightening around the handle. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her, not while he was standing here. I told you to leave, the biker said again, this time with more force, his voice like gravel. I don't care who you are or what you want. You're not getting in here. The man outside seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a grunt, he stepped back, his hand reaching into his jacket. The biker's hand tightened around the knife, but before he could react, the man pulled out a business card and slid it under the door. You'll regret this, the man said, his voice dripping with menace. We'll be watching. With that, he turned and walked away, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement outside. The biker stood there for a moment, his hand still on the door handle, his heart racing. He had expected trouble, but this felt different. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just a random thug looking for a fight. He was part of something bigger, something that wasn't going to back off easily. He looked down at the business card that had been left behind. It was plain, nothing special, but the name on it sent a chill down his spine, Blackstone Security. The biker knew that name. He had crossed paths with Blackstone before, back in his past life. They were a ruthless group, known for getting things done by any means necessary. They had connections everywhere, and they didn't take kindly to anyone getting in their way. The biker knew that this wasn't just a random encounter. Blackstone was after Emily, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. He walked over to the bed and gently shook Emily awake. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she looked up at him with confusion. What's going on? She whispered. We have to leave, the biker said, his voice low and steady. Now. Emily's eyes widened, and she sat up, her heart pounding. What happened? Who was that man? The biker didn't answer her directly. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was, but he knew the danger was far from over. It's okay, just trust me, he said, taking her hand. We need to go before things get worse. Emily nodded, though she looked scared. She had been through enough already, and now this. But she trusted the biker, and that was all that mattered. As they hurriedly packed their things, the biker kept glancing out the window, watching for any sign of movement. The storm had passed, but the real storm was only just beginning. He knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. Blackstone was coming for them, and the biker wasn't about to let them take Emily without a fight. He grabbed his jacket and his helmet, then helped Emily into her coat. Let's go, he said, his voice determined. We're not going down without a fight. With that, they left the room and stepped out into the cold morning air, the biker's mind racing as they disappeared into the night. The biker and Emily drove through the streets, the low rumble of the motorcycle cutting through the cold air. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the empty roads. Every few miles, the biker glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the quiet highway for any sign of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them, that the danger was closing in. Emily sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her small form pressed against his back. She was quiet, her head resting against his shoulder as they rode, but he could feel her unease. She had been through so much already, and now, she was depending on him. The biker had made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't going to break it. They had to keep moving, keep running, until they were out of reach. But the weight of the situation pressed on him. They couldn't run forever. The biker could feel his heart racing as he thought about the men who were after Emily. He had no idea who they were, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they got her. He wasn't going to let that happen. The bike sped through the empty streets, the sound of the engine filling the silence. The biker's eyes narrowed as he saw a figure up ahead, a black car parked on the side of the road. His instincts kicked in, and he slowed the bike, pulling off to the side. He wasn't going to take any chances. He killed the engine, the bike coming to a stop with a soft thud. Stay close to me, the biker said, turning to Emily. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. He could see the tension in her body, the way she was holding on to him like a lifeline. The biker stood up, moving toward the car cautiously, his hand resting on the knife in his belt. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his senses heightened. As he approached the car, he saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. The biker didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching the man. The silence stretched out, the tension thick enough to cut through. The man in the car finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You've been running for a while, haven't you?" The biker's hand tightened around the knife, his muscles tensing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cold. The man smiled, his eyes glinting with something dark. "We're looking for the girl. You've got something we want." The biker's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who this man was. Blackstone Security, the same group that had been after Emily. They had finally found them. "I'm not handing her over to you," the biker growled. The man's smile faded, replaced by a dangerous sneer. "You don't have a choice." Without warning, the man reached for the door handle, pulling it open. The biker took a step back, his hand reaching for his knife, but the man was faster. A gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet morning air. The biker instinctively ducked, the bullet grazing past his ear. He could feel the heat of it as it whizzed by, but he didn't have time to think. He reached for the gun he kept hidden in his jacket and aimed it at the man in the car. The man held up his hands in mock surrender. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, his voice dripping with smugness. "Not unless you want to start a war you can't win." The biker's eyes narrowed. He had been in situations like this before, dangerous, tense standoffs. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had to protect Emily. He glanced over his shoulder at her. She was standing by the bike, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in her gaze now. Something that told him she trusted him. The biker's grip tightened on his gun. He couldn't let this man take her. He couldn't let anyone hurt her again. The man in the car took a step forward, his hands still raised. "You don't understand," he said. "We're just doing our job. You're in way over your head." The biker didn't answer him. He didn't have to. He wasn't afraid of this man, or his threats. He had lived his whole life facing worse dangers than this. He had faced men who had tried to break him, tried to control him, but they had failed. And this man would fail too. Without a word, the biker pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the air, the bullet hitting the man in the shoulder. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his wound, his face contorting in pain. The biker didn't wait for him to recover. He turned and grabbed Emily, pulling her close. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. Emily nodded, and they ran back to the bike. The biker started the engine, the roar of it filling the air as they sped off, leaving the man in the car behind. They were on the move again, but the biker knew that this was just the beginning. The storm was only getting started, and he would do whatever it took to keep Emily safe. The biker's heart pounded in his chest as he rode, the roar of the motorcycle filling the air. Emily clung tightly to his back, her small hands wrapped around his waist. The night had fallen cold, the wind cutting through their clothes as they sped down the empty road. He had no clear destination in mind, only the instinct to keep moving, to keep them ahead of the men who were hunting them. His mind raced, the image of the man in the car and the gunshot still fresh in his mind. He had managed to take down one of them, but that wasn't enough. Blackstone Security was a powerful organization, and if they wanted Emily, they wouldn't stop. The biker knew that. The headlights of their bike cast a wide arc in the dark, illuminating the road ahead, but even the safety of the night felt fragile. Every mile brought them closer to danger. The tension between them was palpable, but Emily didn't speak. She hadn't said much since the confrontation, her body pressed against his as if she were trying to absorb the warmth from him. He couldn't blame her. She had been through so much already. The biker's mind kept flashing back to her eyes, the terror, the confusion, the fragility of someone who had lost everything. He had to keep her safe. He couldn't let them take her. The town ahead was small, barely visible in the distance. They had to stop for fuel, but it felt like a bad idea. Stopping meant risking being seen. But they couldn't outrun the danger forever. He needed to think, needed a place to stop, to plan their next move. The gas station they pulled into was quiet, the only light coming from the flickering sign above the pumps. It was a place that felt abandoned, out of time, and that's exactly what they needed, quiet, unnoticed. The biker parked the motorcycle near the farthest pump, keeping his back to the shadows. He glanced around, his senses alert, before he dismounted. Emily followed closely behind, her steps hesitant, like she was still unsure whether they were safe. He gave her a quick nod to reassure her. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be right back." The gas station attendant, a man in his 50s with a tired face and wrinkled clothes, didn't even look up as the biker approached. "Just gas? Or do you need anything else?" the man asked, his voice flat. The biker shook his head. "Just gas." The man nodded and moved to fill the tank, his disinterested gaze never lifting. The biker couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. He kept an eye on the dark corners of the lot, scanning for movement. The hum of the gas pump was the only sound, but the silence felt thick, heavy. Emily was watching him from near the bike, her hands still wrapped around the helmet he had given her to hold. Her wide eyes were full of uncertainty. The biker quickly paid the attendant, then motioned for Emily to come closer. "We can't stay here long," he said quietly, his voice low. "We'll get back on the road, just stay with me." As they turned to leave, the sound of a car engine caught his attention. It was faint at first, but then the headlights appeared, cutting through the night. The biker's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to draw attention, but the car was coming straight toward them. It slowed as it neared, stopping just a few yards away. A man stepped out of the car, wearing a dark suit and a fedora. He didn't move toward them immediately, but simply stood by the car, his hands in his pockets. The biker instinctively reached for the gun at his side, his body tense. The man didn't look like the usual troublemaker. There was something colder about him, something calculated. Emily, sensing the change, looked up at the biker, her eyes wide with fear. The biker moved to shield her, his gaze never leaving the man. The man spoke in a calm voice, one that carried a weight of authority. "You're not safe here," he said simply. The biker's grip tightened on the gun, but he didn't draw it. "Who are you?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You've been running long enough," he said, his voice almost pitying. "But you can't outrun Blackstone." The biker's pulse quickened. He had heard enough. "What do you want?" The man shrugged slightly, his hands still in his pockets. "I'm just here to deliver a message. You've been a thorn in Blackstone's side for too long. They're offering a deal. You give the girl back, and they'll leave you alone. But if you don't," the man's voice trailed off, and for the first time, the biker noticed the coldness in his eyes. "They won't stop until they get what they want." The biker's jaw clenched. He had expected threats, but hearing it so plainly made something in him snap. "I'm not giving her up," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. The man's smile faltered, and he took a step back. "I didn't think you would." He nodded to the car, where another figure was now sitting, watching them silently. The man turned to leave, but paused for a moment. "This isn't over," he said, before walking back to his car. The biker watched him drive away, the sound of the tires echoing in the quiet night. When the car was gone, he turned back to Emily, his face hard. "They're going to keep coming," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We'll keep moving," she whispered. And for the first time since they started running, the biker knew that there was no turning back. This fight was just beginning. The biker and Emily spent the next few hours on the road, the tension in the air thickening with every mile they put between themselves and the gas station. The rain had stopped, but the storm still loomed in the distance, both in the sky and in their lives. The biker kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing with the conversation he had just had with the man from Blackstone. They had made their offer clear, but there was no way in hell he was giving Emily up. His grip tightened around the handlebars as the wind whipped past them. Emily, still quiet, sat behind him, her small form pressed against his back. He could feel her shiver slightly despite the warm air, a reflection of the fear that still held her. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but what could he say? He had no answers. The truth was, they were in deep now, deeper than he had ever been before. Blackstone wasn't going to back down, and neither would he. His whole life had been about running, about staying out of trouble, but now, he had someone, to protect. That was a new feeling for him, one he wasn't sure how to handle. They came to a small diner on the side of the highway, its neon sign flickering in the night like a warning. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but the biker knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to regroup, plan their next move. They needed to figure out where they could go next. He pulled the bike into a parking spot, the gravel crunching under the tires. Emily didn't say anything as they got off the bike, but he could tell she was still scared. She followed him into the diner, her eyes scanning the empty booths. The biker kept his hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the door. The place was almost empty, save for a lone waitress cleaning off tables and a couple of truckers eating in the corner. The silence was comforting, but it also made the biker feel exposed. He sat down at a booth near the back, his eyes constantly moving, checking for any signs that they were being followed. Emily slid into the seat across from him, her eyes still wide with uncertainty. She didn't speak right away, and neither did he. The biker knew they didn't have much time. Blackstone was coming. It was only a matter of time before they found them. A few minutes passed, and the waitress came over, offering them coffee. The biker ordered a cup and looked at Emily. "You okay?" he asked. His voice soft but firm. She nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. The biker could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a glimmer of trust. She was starting to believe in him, and that scared him more than anything else. "I'll keep you safe," he said, his voice steady. It was a promise, but one he wasn't sure he could keep. They had to get out of here, and soon. He didn't trust the silence of the diner or the emptiness of the town. There was something off about this place. The longer they stayed, the more exposed they were. The waitress brought their coffee, her eyes lingering on them for a moment before she walked away. The biker kept his eyes on the door, watching the street outside. Every car that passed made him tense, his body ready to react. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the night. "Where do we go next?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know. The world had changed in the last few days, and nothing felt safe anymore. He had always lived on the edge, always moved from place to place, but now it was different. Now, he had to protect someone else. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy. "But we'll figure it out." He reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. Emily didn't pull away, and the touch was enough to ground him for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. The biker knew that Emily was depending on him now, and he couldn't let her down. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They needed to keep moving. The man from Blackstone had made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had her. That much was certain. But what wasn't certain was how far they were willing to go to get her. The biker wasn't going to let them win. They could try to break him, but they wouldn't break her. He looked at Emily, her eyes still filled with fear, but also with something else, something that made him believe they could make it through this. Together, they stood up, and the biker paid the bill, his mind already focused on the road ahead. It was time to go, time to leave this place behind. They were far from safe, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The biker and Emily spent the next few hours on the road, the tension in the air thickening with every mile they put between themselves and the gas station. The rain had stopped, but the storm still loomed in the distance, both in the sky and in their lives. The biker kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing with the conversation he had just had with the man from Blackstone. They had made their offer clear, but there was no way in hell he was giving Emily up. His grip tightened around the handlebars as the wind whipped past them. Emily, still quiet, sat behind him, her small form pressed against his back. He could feel her shiver slightly despite the warm air, a reflection of the fear that still held her. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but what could he say? He had no answers. The truth was, they were in deep now, deeper than he had ever been before. Blackstone wasn't going to back down, and neither would he. His whole life had been about running, about staying out of trouble, but now, he had something, someone, to protect. That was a new feeling for him, one he wasn't sure how to handle. They came to a small diner on the side of the highway, its neon sign flickering in the night like a warning. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but the biker knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to regroup, plan their next move. They needed to figure out where they could go next. He pulled the bike into a parking spot, the gravel crunching under the tires. Emily didn't say anything as they got off the bike, but he could tell she was still scared. She followed him into the diner, her eyes scanning the empty booths. The biker kept his hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the door. The place was almost empty, save for a lone waitress cleaning off tables and a couple of truckers eating in the corner. The silence was comforting, but it also made the biker feel exposed. He sat down at a booth near the back, his eyes constantly moving, checking for any signs that they were being followed. Emily slid into the seat across from him, her eyes still wide with uncertainty. She didn't speak right away, and neither did he. The biker knew they didn't have much time. Blackstone was coming. It was only a matter of time before they found them. A few minutes passed, and the waitress came over, offering them coffee. The biker ordered a cup and looked at Emily. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. She nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. The biker could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a glimmer of trust. She was starting to believe in him, and that scared him more than anything else. "I'll keep you safe," he said, his voice steady. It was a promise, but one he wasn't sure he could keep. They had to get out of here, and soon. He didn't trust the silence of the diner or the emptiness of the town. There was something off about this place. The longer they stayed, the more exposed they were. The waitress brought their coffee, her eyes lingering on them for a moment before she walked away. The biker kept his eyes on the door, watching the street outside. Every car that passed made him tense, his body ready to react. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the night. "Where do we go next?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know. The world had changed in the last few days, and nothing felt safe anymore. He had always lived on the edge, always moved from place to place, but now it was different. Now, he had to protect someone else. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy. "But we'll figure it out." He reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. Emily didn't pull away, and the touch was enough to ground him for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. The biker knew that Emily was depending on him now, and he couldn't let her down. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They needed to keep moving. The man from Blackstone had made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had her. That much was certain, but what wasn't certain was how far they were willing to go to get her. The biker wasn't going to let them win. They could try to break him, but they wouldn't break her. He looked at Emily, her eyes still filled with fear, but also with something else, something that made him believe they could make it through this. Together, they stood up, and the biker paid the bill, his mind already focused on the road ahead. It was time to go, time to leave this place behind. They were far from safe, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The storm outside had turned from a mere inconvenience to a full-blown blizzard, with snow piling up in thick drifts and the wind howling around the small, isolated garage. Jake and Emily were no longer alone in the quiet refuge they had found. The garage was now filled with the sounds of Emily's soft breathing, her small form curled up on a cot in the corner, while Jake worked tirelessly on the engine of his bike. The stillness of the place felt surreal, like time itself had slowed down to give them a moment of peace. But even in the silence, Jake couldn't shake the sense that danger was creeping closer. He had always been the one to move quickly, to keep ahead of trouble, but this time, he was caught in a storm, both outside and in his mind. The phone call from Blackstone haunted him. The promise of a price on his head was more than just a warning. It was a countdown. Whoever this mysterious figure was, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And if that meant taking Emily, they would do whatever it took. Jake had no intention of letting that happen. As the hours passed, he worked in silence, his hands moving with the precise, mechanical motions that came from years of fixing engines and dealing with the brutal realities of his past. The weight of Emily's presence in the corner reminded him of why he couldn't let things spiral out of control. She was safe for now, but how long would that last? He finished tightening the last bolt and wiped the grease from his hands, pausing to look at the bike, before turning to check on Emily. Her quiet figure, tucked under the blanket, seemed so small in the vast space of the garage. The snow had begun to fall heavier outside, and the wind was knocking against the thin windows, but inside, they were warm. Jake knew they couldn't stay here much longer. He had to make a plan, and fast. He couldn't afford to wait for Blackstone to find them. He walked over to Emily's cot and knelt beside her, checking her for any signs of distress. She had fallen asleep, her face calm, but the faint lines of worry were still etched into her expression. She trusted him now. He could see it in the way she held on to him during the ride, the way she looked to him for reassurance. But trust didn't mean safety, and Jake knew that better than anyone. The sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway outside caught his attention, and his heart skipped a beat. Who would be coming here in the middle of this storm? He glanced over at Emily, still asleep, and then back toward the door. He reached for the gun he kept nearby, his muscles tensing. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be here. The footsteps outside were slow, deliberate, and Jake could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. He stepped toward the window, peeking out through the small crack in the blinds. A single figure stood at the door, their outline barely visible in the swirling snow. Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his gun as he debated his next move. Could it be someone from Blackstone? Or was it just a random person caught in the storm? He couldn't take the chance. He pulled the gun from its holster and made his way quietly toward the door. He couldn't afford to let anyone get too close to Emily. He peeked through the crack in the door and saw the figure raise their hand, knocking lightly. The knock was strange, almost polite, as if they didn't want to disturb the peace of the place. Jake's instincts told him to wait, to watch, but something about the knock made him pause. It wasn't the aggressive, forceful knock of someone looking to cause trouble. It was a gentle tap, like someone who had been stranded in the storm and was asking for help. Still, Jake wasn't taking any chances. He moved closer to the door, his body tense, his gun still raised. "Who's there?" he called through the door, his voice low but steady. The figure outside didn't answer immediately, but Jake could see them step back, as if giving him space. "I don't want any trouble," the voice from outside said, a woman's voice, soft and strained by the cold. "I'm just looking for shelter. The storm caught me off guard." Jake hesitated, still unsure whether to open the door. But something about her voice, her plea for help, made him think twice. He lowered the gun slightly, his instincts battling with his caution. Finally, he opened the door just a crack, enough to see her more clearly. She was small, no older than Emily, with dark hair matted against her face by the snow. Her clothes were soaked, and she was shivering, her breath coming in short bursts. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to stay out of the storm. I'll leave as soon as it clears, I promise." Jake's heart softened, but he couldn't let his guard down. "Who are you?" he asked, still watching her carefully. "Sarah," she said, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken plea. "I don't want to cause any problems. I've just been caught out here, and I need a place to stay until the storm passes." Jake stood there for a moment, weighing his options. Emily was still asleep, unaware of the conversation happening just outside. He could shut the door, keep things quiet, and deal with whatever came next on his own. Or he could let this woman in, but that meant bringing more uncertainty into an already dangerous situation. His instincts screamed at him to keep things tight, to stay in control. But something in Sarah's eyes, something familiar, made him reconsider. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "You can stay for the night," Jake said, his voice more gentle than he had meant it to be. "But we need to keep things low. No one can know you're here." Sarah nodded, relief flooding her features as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Thank you," she whispered, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Jake watched her closely, still unsure whether this was the right decision. But as the door clicked shut behind her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of kindness was going to change everything. And whatever came next, he would have to be ready to face it. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel quite so alone. He turned back to Emily, his heart heavy with the weight of the choices he had made. Tonight, they had shelter, and for now, that was enough. But tomorrow, the storm outside wouldn't be the only one they'd have to face. The storm had slowed to a light drizzle by the time Jake and Sarah sat in the dim light of the garage. The wind had lost its bite, but the silence between them felt thick, as if the space itself was holding its breath. The old heater hummed in the corner, struggling against the chill of the night, but it provided just enough warmth to keep them from feeling completely exposed. Jake leaned back against the workbench, his hands resting on the tools, though his mind was elsewhere. He could still feel the weight of the decision he had made. Letting Sarah into the garage had been instinctive, but now that she was here, the consequences felt much more real. She was a stranger, someone he knew nothing about, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to push her away. She had a quiet strength that reminded him of things he hadn't thought about in years, things he had buried deep inside. Sarah had settled into the chair near the corner, wrapped in the blanket Jake had given her. She was still a little shaken, her body betraying the fear she had tried to hide earlier. But she wasn't speaking much, and Jake didn't want to press her. He understood silence better than most. There was a long pause before Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft and hesitant, as if testing the waters. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked, her eyes flicking up to meet his. Jake tensed slightly at the question, but he didn't turn away. His past had been a long, tangled mess of violence, regret, and the ghosts of people he had let down. "All the time," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. He glanced over at her, then back at the scattered tools on the bench, trying to ignore the tightening in his chest. "I used to think it was easier to just forget it all. But it never really goes away." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I understand," she said, her tone gentle. "Sometimes, the past is something you can't outrun, no matter how far you go." Jake didn't respond immediately. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't said anything about his past to her, and yet she seemed to understand more than anyone ever had. The sound of the wind outside, the drip of water from the eaves, was the only thing that filled the silence. Finally, Sarah shifted in her seat and looked up at him, her face a little more serious than before. "I don't know who you are, really," she said, her voice steady now. "But I know you didn't have to help me. You didn't have to take me in." Jake's gaze softened, and he gave her a small nod. "I didn't have to, but something about you. I don't know. It just felt right." He didn't know why he said that. It was more than just helping someone in need. It was something deeper, something that made him want to stay and protect her, even though he had spent his whole life running from attachments. Sarah didn't press him for more. Instead, she looked around the garage, her eyes resting on the old bikes and scattered tools. "This place, it's different," she said, almost to herself. "It feels like it has a story." Jake smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It does," he said quietly. "I've spent more years here than I care to admit." His voice hardened as he spoke, and Sarah could hear the weight of the unspoken memories behind his words. "But I'm done with that life." Sarah turned her gaze to him, her expression softening. "Are you sure?" she asked. Jake met her eyes, feeling the weight of the question. The uncertainty in her voice made him hesitate for a moment. But then he nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure. I don't want to be that man anymore." It wasn't a promise, but it was the truth. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he meant it. Sarah didn't say anything more. Instead, she looked down at the blanket wrapped around her, lost in thought. The quiet between them stretched out again, comfortable now, as if the world outside had faded away. The only thing that mattered was the small space they shared, the two of them, trapped in the middle of a storm with nowhere to go but forward. Jake pushed himself off the workbench and walked toward the small fridge in the corner, grabbing a couple of beers. He handed one to Sarah, then cracked open his own, the cold hiss of the can cutting through the stillness. "I don't know what comes next," Jake said, his voice quieter now. "But for tonight, at least, we're safe." Sarah took the beer, her fingers brushing his as she did. "That's all I need for now," she said softly. There was no more talk about the past, no more questions about what the future held. In that moment, they were both just two people in a garage, finding comfort in the quiet and the warmth that surrounded them. The world outside could wait. For tonight, they were exactly where they needed to be. Jake took a long sip of his beer, his gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than he had meant. He had been through a lot in his life, more than most people could ever imagine. But as he sat there, with Emily asleep in the corner and Sarah beside him, he felt a strange peace. He had a second chance now, something he never thought he'd get. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what the road ahead would bring, but he was willing to face it. The storm outside raged on, but inside the garage, the warmth of their shared moment felt like the calm before whatever came next. The morning light crept through the cracks of the garage's worn windows, casting a soft, golden hue over the room. The storm had passed, leaving only the aftermath of a quiet, cold morning. Jake sat at the workbench, the faint hum of the heater the only sound in the space. He stared at the half-finished motorcycle before him, his hands still covered in grease from the night's work, though his mind was far away. He had spent years running from his past, from the people he had hurt and the things he had done. But now, with Emily and Sarah in his life, he was starting to believe that maybe he didn't have to keep running anymore. His hand rested on the old motorcycle's engine, a symbol of his past life and his future. The quiet of the morning settled into a deep, contemplative silence. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of facing it. Emily had woken up earlier, her bright eyes looking at him with that familiar trust. She had asked him what they would do next, and for the first time in a long time, he had no clear answer. But he didn't need one right now. For the moment, they were safe. And that was enough. Sarah had been sitting quietly near the window, watching the snow melt and the world slowly come back to life outside. She hadn't spoken much, but Jake could see the subtle shift in her. She had been through something just as dark as he had, and yet, here she was, still standing. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a way to live again. He glanced over at her, seeing her lost in thought, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the blanket she had wrapped around her. He couldn't help but wonder what she was running from, what had brought her here. He had learned to keep people at arm's length, but something about Sarah made him want to know her story. He stood up and walked over to the small table, grabbing 2 cups of coffee from the pot. He set one down in front of her, watching as she looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Thanks," she said quietly, her voice soft. Jake nodded, taking a seat across from her. The warmth of the coffee did little to ease the weight of the questions that still lingered in the air between them. He wanted to ask her about her past, but something told him that now wasn't the time. They had all been through enough. The sound of a motorcycle engine roaring in the distance caught his attention, and he stood up, moving toward the window. He could hear the faint rumble of multiple engines, the unmistakable sound of a group of riders approaching. His heart sank. He knew what this meant. They had found him. The thought was both terrifying and inevitable. Blackstone wasn't going to stop. He had been given a second chance, but now it seemed that second chance was about to be tested. Jake's hand went to his jacket, fingers brushing over the leather, feeling the weight of the life he had left behind. He had spent years running, but it wasn't just his past he was running from anymore. It was the people who had shaped it, the ones who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He turned to Sarah, who had noticed the shift in his demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the door and peered outside, watching as the riders came into view. There were at least 10 of them, their bikes lined up in the snow, the cold wind carrying the sound of their engines through the quiet town. It was a chilling sight. Sarah stood up, moving toward him, but he held up a hand, signaling her to stay back. He didn't want her caught in this. He had already let her into his world once, and now that decision was coming back to haunt him. The riders dismounted, their leather jackets bearing the familiar patches of Blackstone. They were here for him, and they were not going to leave without a fight. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. The last thing he wanted was to bring trouble to Emily and Sarah, but he knew what had to be done. He had made a promise to protect them, and he wasn't about to let that go now. He turned to Sarah, his expression hardening. "Stay inside," he said, his voice firm. "Don't come out unless I tell you." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Jake shook his head. "This is my fight, not yours." He didn't wait for her response, walking toward the door. His boots crunched in the snow as he stepped outside, the cold biting at his face. The riders were waiting for him, their eyes scanning him with a mixture of familiarity and contempt. "Jake Morrison," one of them called out, a man with a scarred face and a deep voice. "You've got something that belongs to us." Jake didn't flinch, his stance steady and unwavering. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his voice low. "You're in the wrong place." The man smirked, stepping forward. "I think you know better than that." Jake's hand hovered near the gun tucked inside his jacket, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been here before, too many times before. But this time, it was different. This time, he had something worth protecting. The man's gaze flickered to the garage, and Jake knew what he was thinking. He wasn't just after him. He was after everything Jake had built since leaving the club. His past had come back to collect its due, and it was about to take everything from him again. But Jake wasn't going down without a fight. He had been through too much, fought too hard to stay alive, and now he had a family. He wasn't going to lose them without a fight. The wind howled around them, the snow swirling in the air like a blinding mist. The riders took their positions, their faces cold and unreadable. But Jake wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, the cold air biting at his skin, his mind clear and focused. He had a purpose now, and nothing, not even Blackstone, was going to take that away from him. The The battle was about to begin.